Okay, we're now to our last theme of turn of the 20th century economic growth and expansion. I've already talked about in previous videos industrialization in the West, and we're now going to conclude by talking about immigration. Prior to 1870, most immigrants to America came from more northern and western sources, such as Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, even Norway and Sweden. This was the area where most of the so-called old immigrants, the old stock immigrants, came from. However, at the turn of the 20th century, from 1871 to approximately 1921, the era that we're in question right now, this turn of the 20th century, most of the new immigrants are coming from new sources of Europe, such as Southern and Eastern Europe, such as Italy and Greece and Poland, eventually Poland, Russia, present-day Yugoslavia and Hungary. These are new sources of immigration, and of course the map showing in the orange areas over 30% foreign-born. So many of the new industrial cities, some of the plains starting to fill up with these new immigrants, new sources of people. Immigrants, of course, are coming to America seeking freedom. They're seeking better lives for their families. Of course, the jobs that are available from industrialization is very much a beckoning reason for them to come. This is a great photo showing kind of the escape from Europe, from intolerance, from oppression. There's sort of showing the Kaiser, war clouds forming for the World War I era coming. And then, of course, they're all coming to America. The modern Moses being Uncle Sam, parting the waters, coming to the land of opportunity. Please remember, too, a lot of the impulse to come is that it's easier to come. At the turn of the 20th century, we have new steamboat travel that makes it a bit quicker. That's not to say that it was an easy trip. The poor immigrants, those who are coming from Southern Eastern Europe, oftentimes could only afford third-class passage, which was called steerage. This was below deck. Oftentimes you're sharing space with other people that you don't know, eating whatever ship food was available, not really in the nice quarters of the above deck that first and second class had. This is a famous picture of the Titanic before it went down. And of course, just like if you've seen the movie, Jack is a member of steerage, and he's trying to woo Rose, who's a member of the upper class. So that movie does show that aspect of the turn of the 20th century. The first sign that they had finally made it, if you're talking about immigrants coming from Southern Eastern Europe, was of course the Statue of Liberty. This was a gift to us from France, celebrating an anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, of which, of course, France was an ally of ours, helping us win our independence. The official title of the Statue of Liberty was Liberty Lighting the World, so it was an outward expression of liberty. However, the immigrants coming to America kind of shaped the meaning of the Statue of Liberty. There was actually a contest to sort of give meaning to the Statue of Liberty during this time of immigration, and Emma Lazarus won that competition. She wrote this poem, The New Colossus, in which she talks about the immigrants when she says, "Give me your tired, give me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." So unlike the idea that it was an outward expression of liberty, the immigrants kind of make America a beckoning call for them to come here to the United States to seek opportunity, that we are a land of opportunity, and that liberty is one of those freedoms, and liberty and opportunity is all associated with America. Of course, once you made it and you're sitting out here in your ship, you're amongst the huddled masses. Like you can see, they look like they've about had it after their trip across the ocean. You'd be quarantined, sort of not allowed to get off the ship immediately. The officials would inspect the rich class, first and second class. They didn't think they had anything wrong with them disease-wise or money-wise, but steerage had to be checked out more carefully. And the primary processing center for European immigrants at the turn of the 20th century was a place called Ellis Island. So if you get your bearings here, there's New York City, Twin Towers before 9/11, and of course this is New York Harbor, this is the Statue of Liberty, and right here is Ellis Island. And this is a more close-up shot. This is the main building where the processing, the legal and the medical inspection of the third class passage would take place. It's a pretty large federal complex. It also had offices and a hospital, but this is the main building where most of the processing took place. When immigrants got off the boat on the main building at Ellis Island, they were given ID tags, which basically told which ship they had come in and where they would be found on the ship's manifest. This would become important later when the officials would ask questions about their status, about questions that they needed to know about their finances, about why they came, about their political affiliations, so they could find them on the ship's manifest catalog. It also lists, of course, their name. This is Petito, who came on the SS Italia. The initial processing was a medical inspection. It was a quick kind of line inspection where doctors would kind of watch immigrants as they came up the stairs carrying all their things from home. If they suspected something was wrong, they would mark them with chalk on their lapel. So this lady looks to have been marked with an E, something wrong with her eyes that needed further inspection. They pull you out of the line, they check you further, and if everything was okay, then you go on to the next part. If something was really wrong with you, then you would have to go to the hospital, or if you had an untreatable disease or a disease that was not allowed to be introduced into America, you could face deportation. One of those really dangerous eye diseases that officials were looking for was trachoma. Is a particularly dangerous disease because it could lead to blindness. It was also a pretty scary part of the process because the only way officials would look for trachoma is by flipping the immigrant's eyelid reverse, either with bare hands or with a button hook at times. And so you can see this immigrant having their eyes checked and this guy waiting quite anxiously for his turn. If you had trachoma, you would face deportation because it was highly contagious and Americans did not want that introduced. And they feared the new immigrants from southern Eastern Europe were more likely to have this disease than the more wealthy or the old stock immigrants. If you made it through the health inspection, this is the famous registry room where you'd wait for your turn to be questioned once again by a line of federal officials who was holding the ship's manifest. You can see all their ID badges again, so they'd find your name, like we saw before from the ID badge, on the ship's manifest. They would ask you about your political beliefs. Are you an anarchist, for example? Are you a socialist? And of course you would say no or face deportation. Were you married? Women who were unmarried would not be allowed to leave the island unless they had a sponsor. Maybe a brother was coming, maybe your husband was already in the country, but they would not let single women loose in the city. Any prospective employment, you had to be really careful about answering that because American employers were not allowed to recruit overseas for cheap labor that would take an American job. So you just had to say, well, I have prospects of employment, but I had not already been offered a job, or you could be deported. Your skills, what did you have to offer the country, so that you would not be jobless or skillless and a burden to American citizens. Overall, 80% of immigrants going through Ellis Island within a couple hours were off and on their way. Of course, the other 20% maybe were left at the hospital for treatable conditions or in the process of being deported. A third of those immigrants leaving Ellis Island will stay in New York City and find employment and life there. Others will buy their tickets. There was a ticketing agency at Ellis Island to go to points further west, maybe Chicago, maybe to the free land we talked about, the Homestead Act in the west. Maybe they had other plans. This is, of course, a current sort of list of ideas of our nation's policy about how to become a naturalized American citizen. Moral character is included, ideas of the Constitution, understanding American history and government, oath of allegiance. So some of the ideas, of processing, of making sure people are somewhat qualified, if you will, to become an American citizen kind of have overlapped with our nation's history with immigration. There's no immigrant processing center per se, but the ideas of sort of qualifications are still somewhat apparent. At the turn of the 20th century, there's a lot of mixed feelings about the new immigrants. This one we talked about in class, showing a more positive image of immigrants. That Uncle Sam, the caption reads, is a man of strong features. And of course, it's made up of all these different ethnic groups, Native American, included in that. However, at the turn of the 20th century, there's a lot of nativist groups. This is not speaking about Native Americans. These are groups that are formed of the old stock. My ancestors came from England. My ancestors came from Germany. They're the old source of immigrants. And they feared the new immigrants from Southern Eastern Europe would take their jobs, that they were, of religiously or culturally inferior stock. And so they formed the restriction leagues, the protective associations to protect the old stock immigrants. And of course, it was somewhat hypocritical, because as these old stock immigrants are telling the new immigrants to stay out, of course, over their back is the shadow that at one point their ancestors too, came without money, came without land, came seeking opportunities, and now they're kind of snubbing their nose at the new generation who only wants the same thing, wants those same opportunities. And as a nation of immigrants, everyone at some point, with the exception of Native Americans themselves, have come from someplace else. These are some other political cartoons showing America's anti-immigrant attitude. Uncle Sam, kind of the platform is, yes, America, come on in, but not being very welcoming, fearing poverty, fearing disease, fearing, that they're anarchist, as we talked about before, that we don't want the new immigrants. This one showing, of course, also an anti-immigrant cartoon, Danger, the riffraff of Europe coming, Uncle Sam being kind of overwhelmed by the massive tide of new immigrants arriving into the country. Similar here, that Uncle Sam's open immigration policies is somewhat encouraging all the riffraff, this way depicted as gutter rats, and all the kings and czars of Europe are happy to unload their populations on America. But, is this wise? Should America continue an open immigration policy? Even here showing that some of these are members of the Black Hand, which is a group that will be associated with the start of World War I. We'll talk about with the assassination of the Archduke. So all of this depicted as a dangerous situation. There's even an association at the turn of the 20th century of anti-immigrant feeling with the eugenics movement, which basically was the idea that through selective genetics that you would have a well-born population, that if you introduced new blood from Southern Eastern Europe that was more prone to crime and kidnapping and all these terrible conditions, even social conditions like poverty and thievery and alcoholism, they associate with genetics. So in order to keep them out, eugenicists would say that American policy towards immigrants needed to be a bit more harsh, that we only wanted the strong stock to be allowed into the country. So these are all examples of that side of genetic testing. Babies born will develop normal, high-grade people. This was somewhat of a 4-H process. They even gave fitter family contests to those who essentially measured in beauty and intelligence and mental health and were good gene stocks, and your picture would be in the paper and you'd have a medal. These are all kind of strange for us to think about as Americans, because this sort of eugenicist attitude later becomes associated with Hitler, and the purity of the race, and his ethnic cleansing in Europe and the Holocaust. And so America at one point had an anti-immigrant feeling that was somewhat associated with the horror of what would become World War II later. At the time, however, before World War II, the anti-immigrant feeling kind of transpired into some new laws to limit the new immigrants. One of the more famous is the Immigration Restriction Act, which limited nationalities to only 3% of who was in the country in 1910. So whereas before we were allowing everybody, the wide open sort of immigration policy, and poor Ellis Island over here was having a difficult time selecting who was safe, and so America was under siege is the message. So now that you've essentially cut this off, and by only allowing a percentage, you have a smaller source. So only 3% is coming. It's a much more easy transition for America to limit immigration. So the anti-immigration feeling kind of did play up in the laws that were passed at the turn of the 20th century. Similar to Ellis Island, there was an Angel Island as a processing center for immigrants coming from Asia, like China and Japan. This was in San Francisco, sometimes called the Ellis Island of the West Coast, or the Guardian of the Western Gate, which implies again that they wanted to check out the immigrants to guard against anyone they didn't want coming in. This one was a little bit different than Ellis Island in that it was an old military barracks, and so they were housed in military barracks while waiting to enter the country, while going through physical and mental inspections. Detention in this case, unlike at Ellis Island, which might only be a couple hours, could last for weeks or years. Part of that comes from the fact that there was a great fear that the Chinese in particular was in competition for American jobs. So the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese laborers, and so in order to check and see if you were Chinese, if you qualified as a laborer, and you weren't trying to sneak into the country illegally, Angel Island took a bit more time for people to inspect. These are some of the cartoons showing, again, sort of a similar Asian immigration stance, as Uncle Sam is trying to keep back the tide of Asian immigrants. This one's sort of, again, a corruption of Lady Liberty with Asian features and associated with negativity of those immigrants bringing, immorality and filth and all these things that are associated with the anti-immigrant movement. A similar, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant old stock newspaper wanting anti-immigrant policies to sort of protect American jobs and American life. There was a movement called the Paper Sons and Daughters movement, in which there were Chinese immigrants who would try to claim to be children of American citizens because that would be a way into the country. So without being deported as a laborer, you had to prove that you were a child of an existing Chinese American. This produced a whole sort of network of forged paperwork and documents whereby people would produce claims to be children of American citizens, and all of that in an effort to get off Angel Island and not be deported. Angel Island will eventually close in 1940. The Chinese will be an American ally in World War II, so it didn't make sense to have these strong anti-Chinese policies anymore. And you see on the walls frustration on the part of Chinese immigrants that were detained there, kind of questioning the West and questioning America with the anti-immigrant policies that were in place at the time. The influx of immigrants will contribute to the development of cities, which is known as urbanization. New cities like Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, all will surpass 1 million people. Oftentimes new immigrants would settle in ethnic neighborhoods like Little Italy, Chinatown, and they and their children will work to learn English, adopt American customs, become American citizens, and of course schools, public schools, will serve an essential role in this process of blending in to, or assimilating into what's known as the melting pot, the American melting pot, where you have a number of different cultures coming into a new American culture as children learn English and American history and American customs. Life in the cities for new immigrants presented a lot of challenges. There were housing shortages and a desperate need for public services such as water and sewage systems. Immigrants would live in these so-called tenements, which were multi-family dwellings that were cheap, they were crowded, and oftentimes associated with crime and poverty and disease. And of course, these are some of the statistics about life in the tenements. Very unhealthy, very dark, very rough life. And of course, old stock Americans, the nativist, will blame the immigrants for these conditions, bringing these conditions with them, when in fact it was the situation largely that they found themselves in that created these problems. These are some other pictures of some of the inner alleys of the tenements, children on the street, gangs formed, the trash, the sewage issues. There was no running water in some of these tenements. Sewage was just dumped out back, and that bred a lot of the disease in the areas. So these pictures are showing some of the life in the tenements. Very overcrowded. This is one of the tenements showing how dark it was, her laundry and clothing, and the kitchen and the sink and everything is all in one room, very small space. There's another picture. Many of these pictures are taken by Jacob Riss in New York City. We'll talk about him associated with the progressive movement, which again is the reform movement that's going to respond to a lot of these challenges of the turn of the 20th century, the need for changes and improvement in life in the cities. There's another one showing the overcrowded conditions. With all the people and the sprawling urban centers, there's also a need for public transportation improvements. New York City develops the very first subway system, and Richmond, Virginia, actually develops the first electric streetcar or trolley system to sort of network the industrial sector from the living sector to the market sector of these cities. So please review these slides about immigration, life in the cities, as well as the other turn of the 20th century slides.